CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Travel disruption across the world as several airlines cancel flights into the United States in row about aviation safety and new 5G phone providers.
Our other headlines: does Xbox have the X factor? Shares in PlayStation Sony tumble after its rivals plans the biggest deal in gaming history.
The threat of war in Europe. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken calls on Russia to choose a diplomatic path on Ukraine.
The UK Prime Minister fighting for political survival as senior members of his own party resign.
And the cost of living continues to soar. British inflation hits its highest level in 30 years.
Several international airlines have cancelled flights to the United States over safety concerns about 5G phone services near airports.
There have been warnings that the signals could interfere with navigation systems in aircraft, in particular the Boeing 777 and Airbus A380.
Cancellations came even after two 5G providers delayed rolling out their service. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent John Terrett in New York. John, just give us an idea of the scale of this disruption.
Well, Jamie and Robin, it's very important for our viewers all over the world to understand what's happening here. This is a situation of which we had some warning, but it is now getting really quite serious, and it's important to understand. Now, in a tweet, Air India has let it be known that they're no longer planning to fly to New York, New Jersey, San Francisco or Chicago because of this issue. Emirates, which is one of the very, very successful Middle Eastern airlines, all the Middle Eastern airlines are actually very successful. Emirates out of Dubai, 9 US destinations now off the docket for the time being, though my understanding is they're still flying to JFK, Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles. And then I have notification of 2 Japanese airlines, All Nippon and Japan Airlines, who say they're cancelling some flights to the United States after consultation with Boeing, who told them this is a very potentially serious issue and you must take it seriously. My understanding is that among the aircraft affected, the Boeing 777, the 787, and some 737s, though I suspect they are the older models, and also, as you said at the top there, the Airbus A380 as well. Now, all of this coming despite some reprieve in the past 24 hours when the 2 giant cell phone carriers here, the legacy one, AT&T, and Verizon, scaled back the launch of their 5G service. So they have launched today, as they planned to, after multiple delays in the past. They have launched today, but what they've done is they've scaled back the launch in areas where there are major airports. And of course, that's the point, you see. You can't get around America without flying. All these states have major, major airports in them. And so the 5G launch has been scaled back in those areas. President Biden, yesterday, Tuesday, thanked them for that. So the White House is actively engaged with the Federal Aviation Administration. Meanwhile, the airlines, all of them, including the logistics companies FedEx and UPS, are warning that there could be 1,000 to 1,100 flights a day cancelled if this problem isn't sorted out. And this is the problem. Both AT&T and Verizon spent billions of dollars, about $65 billion each, buying space on the radio spectrum. Now, the space that they bought is dangerously close to the same space that is used by aircraft instrumentation systems, and it's particularly relevant for the radar altimeter. Now, the thing is, when pilots are coming into land at airports in good weather, they have visual flight rules. They can fly quite happily. But these aircraft are licensed to fly in very, very severely bad weather, quite safely, but they are licensed to fly in conditions where the pilots really can't see the runway until the last minute. And this is the problem. These radar altimeters basically are very close to the 5G service, and there's a danger that they may overlap. And I have to tell you, there was a Turkish Airlines crash in 2009, which was attributed to just this situation. So the Federal Aviation Administration on Sunday licensed 45% of US commercial fleet to fly in areas where there is 5G, but that still leaves 55%. And the worry is that that 55% of aircraft, many of them older aircraft, will actually end up being grounded if this goes on much longer. And, of course, that could lead to enormous delays for people flying around the country and also for people flying in from overseas as well. Guys?
John, you can't muck around with airline safety. Is there a compromise to be had? Is there a solution to this problem?
Well, the good news is there is a solution. I'll come on to that in just a second, but I think I should just point out that the third wireless company here, T-Mobile, Sprint, they have the greatest coverage of 5G at the moment. And their bit of the spectrum, the bit of the spectrum that they purchase for huge amounts of money, is well away from this area that is affecting the airliners potentially bought by AT&T and by Verizon. The bit we're talking about is called the C-band. Now, AT&T and Verizon say, look, we paid billions for this, and the C-band 5G has been rolled out in at least 40 locations around the world. No problem so far. So it looks as if the compromise will be some kind of buffer zone. Now, my understanding is that there is already a 3.2-kilometre buffer zone around many of these airports, but the airlines say that may not be enough and it may need to be more. So I think the compromise is going to end up being that if you are with AT&T or Verizon and you are a 5G customer, your 5G is going to taper off as you get closer to the airport, and there won't be any in the airport at all. And experts that I'm listening to are telling me that actually that will probably be enough for 90% of the network to be up and running safely. But a lot of head scratching here, you know, because I mean, this has been, we were talking about this last year, this possibility, and now it is here on the eve yesterday, and now the day of the rollout for these companies. It's beggars belief in many ways that the authorities, the aviation authorities, the communication authorities, the airlines and the telephone companies couldn't have come to some kind of agreement over this much, much earlier, and once again avoiding the cancellations in US aviation, which is the last thing Americans need, and international passengers as well. Guys?
John, thanks for that. John Terrace, our correspondent in New York.
UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been told to resign by senior members of his own party. Speculation is mounting that a leadership contest could be imminent in the wake of allegations about Downing Street parties. Just as the Conservative leader was about to face Parliament at Prime Minister's question time, a Conservative MP first elected in 2019 defected to the opposition Labour Party. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent, Naweed Jabarkal. So, Naweed, what's the latest?
Well, I don't think anyone was expecting Boris Johnson to have an easy time when he appeared at Prime Minister's questions today, Robin, but he wouldn't have been helped by the fact that just before he came in and sat down, about 10 minutes before Prime Minister's questions got underway, Mr. Wakeford decided to stand up, cross the House and sit on the opposition benches, saying he was defecting to the Labour Party. It may have galvanised some of the Conservative backbenchers to cheer louder for the Prime Minister, so immediately it may have had a big boost for him, but secretly behind the scenes I think the Conservative Party and Boris Johnson will be worried, because Christian Wakeford represents a seat called Bury South, a local area called Bury South in the north of England near Manchester, a so-called red wall Tory he is. That's because that part of the country traditionally has voted for the Labour Party. Boris Johnson flipped that on its head in 2019 at the general election when he won seat after seat in the north of England. In his defection letter, he said that one of the reasons he left was because the Conservatives weren't doing enough for the local area. And so I think that will be a concern for the party as it looks to try and hold on to the gains that it's made in the north of England and maintain that, particularly with the next election set to come up in 2024 or possibly sooner, depending on what happens in the next few days and weeks. Here's a bit about what Keir Starmer had to say when that defection was made in the House earlier today.
I start by warmly welcoming the honourable member for Bury South to his new place in the House and to the Parliamentary Labour Party. Mr. Speaker, like so many people up and down the country, he has concluded that the Prime Minister and the Conservative Party have shown themselves incapable of offering the leadership and government this country deserves.
Now, the actual business of the day was supposed to be about policy, usually in the House of Parliament. Instead, it was dominated again by what's come to be known as Partygate, these allegations of parties taking place at Downing Street. The leader of the opposition usually gets 6 questions to throw at the Prime Minister, all of them Keir Starmer choosing to push the Prime Minister on whether he knew about these parties, whether he attended them and how much he knew as well. What isn't helping Boris Johnson is that the story from Downing Street seems to be changing. In December, at first, the Downing Street number 10 said that there were no parties at all. A video emerged shortly after that showing that that wasn't the case. Staff in Downing Street joking about the issue, which led to one of Boris Johnson's most senior advisers having to step down from her role. Later on, there was an insistence that more allegations of parties and an insistence that perhaps these parties did take place, but whether they were parties or not, the Prime Minister said he wasn't sure. And yesterday, a really, really significant interview, actually, the Prime Minister did, a pool interview, where he said that he categorically denied claims put forward by Dominic Cummings. You'll remember that name. He used to be Boris Johnson's right-hand man and chief advisor, key member of that election victory in 2019. He says the Prime Minister knew it was a party. Boris Johnson said he categorically denied that yesterday, and I think that could be an important point in how this story plays out. But here's what Boris Johnson had to say in the Commons in Parliament. Remember when Keir Starmer pushed him on whether he had misled Parliament and lied about the entire situation.
To be absolutely clear, the right honourable gentleman is continuing to ask a series of questions which he knows will be fully addressed by the inquiry. He is wasting this House's time. He's wasting the people's time, Mr. Speaker. He continues to be completely irrelevant, Mr. Speaker, because we have an inquiry. We have an inquiry, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not going to anticipate that inquiry any further.
And Noid, in the background, of course, many keeping count on the letters of no confidence being submitted. 54 needed to trigger a no confidence vote. What do we know?
Yeah, well, those Red Wall Tories, another 10 of them reportedly putting in letters to the 1922 committee chaired by a man called Graham Brady. He'll need to receive 54 letters in order to trigger this vote of no confidence. There are suggestions in the UK media today that that figure could be reached, almost 60 Conservative MPs indicating that they have criticised Boris Johnson, so it might only be a matter of time. Perhaps more worryingly, Boris Johnson's former Brexit minister, David Davis, another senior name in the Conservative Party, stood up in Parliament in Prime Minister's questions and said that it was time for Boris Johnson to resign.
I expect my leaders to shoulder the responsibility for the actions they take. Yesterday, he did the opposite of that. So I'll remind him of a quotation altogether too familiar to him of Leo Amery to Neville Chamberlain. You have sat there too long for all the good you have done. In the name of God, go.
Now, let's break this down. If there is a vote of no confidence, if that 54-figure threshold is reached, then perhaps Boris Johnson wins. Remember, Theresa May had a vote of no confidence, which she survived as well. And I think for the Conservative Party, even though there's a lot of anger in the party about the way Boris Johnson has handled this and the mixed messaging coming out of Downing Street, I think they'll be very conscious about pushing the Prime Minister because there are local elections coming up in May. They don't want to be in a weaker position heading into those. But more importantly, the pandemic is still ongoing. Boris Johnson has won some credits for rolling out vaccines, some of the fastest rollouts in the world here in the United Kingdom, with a large proportion of the population already vaccinated. And this is the world's 5th largest economy, remember, facing inflation, which has just hit a 30-year high today. In fact, there are lots of challenges, and I don't think the Conservative Party will be wanting to look for a 4th Prime Minister since 2016. So even if Boris Johnson does face a vote of no confidence, this isn't the end of the story yet. But whatever happens, one thing is for sure, this is going to be a big stain on the Prime Minister's legacy when Boris Johnson eventually does decide to leave.
Naveed Jabakel, thank you very much.
Well, as Naweed mentioned there, while Boris Johnson hangs on to his jobs by his fingernails, rising inflation is hitting the UK hard. Soaring food costs and energy bills are driving up prices at their fastest rate in almost 30 years, squeezing living standards.
Inflation surged to 5.4% in the 12 months to December, up from 5.1% the month before, in another blow to struggling families. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent, Michael Voss in London. So, Michael, we hear a lot about rising inflation, but what does it really mean for people?
Well, as you say, Robin, the highest inflation rate in 30 years, 5.4%. You've got not just the energy costs, which we've known about for a while, but rising food prices, clothes prices, furniture and restaurant prices, all pushing up the rate of inflation. And it's putting tremendous pressure on household incomes, and it's only likely to get worse. In April this year, we're going to see a tax increase, the national insurance tax increase to pay for the COVID measures. And at the same time, the cap on domestic electric and gas prices will also be lifted, and that could really push up domestic heating and electric costs. All of this at a time when wages are failing to keep up with inflation. The latest figures from the Office of National Statistics, which only go up as far as November, show that in November, when it was 5.1%, the gap between inflation and wage increases meant a real loss of earnings of about 1.6%. And that loss of earnings is getting greater. The risk is it's going to push millions more people into poverty. And the real worry is that with the lowest income families, we're already seeing an increasing number of food banks, for example, around the country. And and increasingly, families are being forced to make difficult decisions between heating their homes and between buying food. Robin.
And Michael, what's being done to mitigate against this rising inflation?
Well, raising interest rates is one of the methods that's being used. You may remember back in December, the Bank of England, for the first time in many months, raised the interest rate from 0.1 to 0.25%. The Monetary Committee of the Bank of England is due to meet in early February, where it's expected to double the interest rate again to 0.5%. Their aim is to try and keep inflation down to 2%. And if that's not working, then maybe later in the year we'll see even more interest rates. Inflation's proving a big headache for the government, which says it's already committed some $16 billion to helping families cope over a 2-year period. But the Finance Minister, Rishi Sunak, is under pressure to come up with yet more measures to help the poorest in society.
Michael Voss, thank you.
The European Union is being urged to ban energy-intensive crypto mining. According to the Financial Times, one of the EU's top financial regulators told the newspaper that a rising proportion of renewable energy is being used to mine currencies, causing a serious risk of countries not meeting climate targets. He wants the EU to enforce a less energy-intensive form of making currency.
Chinese tech firm ByteDance is disbanding its strategic investment team. Sources say the move is a response to new anti-monopoly rules which are being drafted by Beijing, but that's been denied by China's Cyberspace Administration. The company, which owns the TikTok app, had already scaled back its investment operation.
The sale of a 16th century villa in Rome containing the only ceiling mural ever painted by the Italian master Caravaggio has been rescheduled and the asking price reduced by 20% after an auction failed to attract any bids. The artwork was painted in the 16th century, although it was covered for many years and only uncovered in the 1960s.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Tonga's tsunami. It may take weeks to establish communications and fix the undersea cable carrying phone and internet.
Beijing, China's capital and its cultural nerve center. A modern metropolis with traditional roots. And now it becomes the first city in the world to host both Summer and Winter Olympics. After 14 years, the biggest sporting extravaganza returns to Beijing. Thousands of athletes from around the globe will compete in over 100 events at 3 zones. Cheered on by over 1.4 billion Chinese citizens and millions abroad. CGTN will bring you a ringside view of the historic event. 2022 Beijing Olympics, the games that matter on CGTN. See the difference.
This week on Razor, Guy Henderson meets the scientists who are working to revive the underwater kelp forests along the UK's coastline and bring back its biodiversity.
This is a small experimental area, but if we can prove that the removal of trawler pressure itself results in a rewilding and a regeneration and a recovery of things like fisheries for local fisheries and so forth, then it's an argument for doing it everywhere.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Japanese technology giant Sony has had $20 billion wiped from its market value in just one day. Shares in Sony plummeted 13% in Tokyo after the announcement from rival Microsoft that it plans to buy mega games company Activision Blizzard. The deal would be a major step for Microsoft's Xbox gaming brand in its battle against Sony's PlayStation. And it would be the largest acquisition in gaming history. If the deal, which is worth nearly $70 billion, goes through, it will see the US firm Microsoft owning popular video game franchises, including Call of Duty and World of Warcraft. Another possible merger, consumer goods giant Unilever has signalled it will keep pursuing a blockbuster deal to buy GlaxoSmithKline's healthcare arm, which owns brands such as Sensodyne toothpaste and Panadol. Unilever has already had a $68 billion offer rejected. Meanwhile, UK pharmacy chain Boots is expected to be sold by its American owner Walgreens for an estimated $13 billion. The owners of Asda Supermarket are believed to have joined a raft of private equity firms readying their bids. Well, Susanna Streeter is a senior investment and markets analyst at Hargreaves Lansdown. I asked her what Microsoft wanted out of the deal.
I think this really does show Microsoft's vision in terms of putting itself right at the forefront of the revolution in the so-called metaverse, really seeing gaming as huge potential. It's willing to part with this huge sum of cash. And we've seen a string of acquisitions. Mojang, for example, the Minecraft owner, it bought that quite a few years back. Obviously, it bought ZeniMax, that other big acquisition, the parent company of the game firm Bethesda. So really demonstrating how Microsoft is angling for a prime seat in the future of the metaverse.
And we saw Sony shares slide on the news. Do you think this is all part of a move towards greater consolidation in the market?
Well, I think Sony shares fell because, of course, the PlayStation manufacturer, there are concerns that it could lose out if Microsoft, which of course owns Xbox, limits who can play the games that it will control in the future. And so I think that was the big fear and why Sony's share price fell. And of course, this deal still needs to go through regulatory hurdles, antitrust hurdles, because there is concern it could end up being anti-competitive and perhaps consumers may lose out. I know certainly how frustrating young gamers find it when they can't play with their friends who might be on different platforms. So there will be concern that actually this might not be in consumers' best interest for the short term.
Well, let's talk about Unilever now then and its approach for GSK. Both own some big UK brands. So what's in it for them, and do you think the bid will eventually be successful?
Yes, interesting this. I mean, Unilever clearly sees the healthcare business GSK as a strategic fit. Of course, it includes Aquafresh toothpaste and Panadol, and that could help complement Unilever's own huge consumer ranges where sales have been rather sluggish. But so far, the Domestos and Magnum makers being given the cold shoulder by GSK, because GSK clearly believes that this sector offers much greater potential than the 50 billion that's being offered by Unilever. Now, we did see the share price of Unilever fall because I think investors thought perhaps really it should get its own struggling sales in order before going on a spending spree, whilst GSK shares rose amid expectation that it could end up being a bidding war with perhaps private equity sniffing around this part of the business as well. And GSK does want to offload it, but clearly is looking for a higher price tag. Now, we have since seen Unilever recoup some of those losses, as it doesn't look like yet that there is another bid forthcoming, and GSK's gains have dwindled a little. So it's wait and see for this at the moment.
And one more I wanted to talk about, the big British high street brand Boots. It's a really well-known pharmacy here in the UK, but actually owned by US firm Walgreens. And now they're looking to sell it, so who might be interested?
Well, it is speculation. There's quite a lot of speculation swirling around that actually the owners of Asda, those private equity backers, TDR Capital, could be circling Boots after Walgreens said it intended to put it up for sale. And it's interesting to see that in its last results, actually, sales seem to be pretty brisk, up by just over 8% for the UK arm, after quite a few years of really poor sales. Certainly it seems to have been in a bit of a lost corner of Walgreens, despite the fact that it has a pretty iconic brand now in the UK in terms of beauty, number 7. So I do think that there should be interest, whether or not it's sold as a complete entity or perhaps whether brands are individually sold off that Boots owns and the stores are sold off elsewhere. We just have to see.
Relief efforts are underway in Tonga, where the country is contending with an unprecedented disaster, according to the Pacific nation's leader.
New Zealand is pivotal in providing aid, with the government and private citizens there getting involved. Owen Poland reports now from Auckland.
The first images have begun to emerge of the catastrophic damage inflicted on Tonga by last weekend's deadly eruption, which has now officially claimed the lives of at least 3 people. Military photos show some of the destruction, but these before and after satellite images are even more revealing, with previously lush green foliage covered in a thick layer of toxic ash.
Your heart aches and your spirit drops because we're also connected to the people of Tonga.
Sir Michael Jones is one of New Zealand's greatest rugby players, and he's thrown his weight behind a Tongan relief project that aims to fill as many shipping containers as possible with food and water to send to Tonga.
Initially, this one here is a community initiative, so it's family to family. So if you have families in Tonga and you want to send stuff to Tonga, we'll send it for you free of charge.
The first official statement from Tonga's government describes it as an unprecedented disaster, in which 15-metre-high tsunami waves completely destroyed homes on some islands. And there's growing frustration about the lack of phone and internet contact because of a broken communications cable that could take 4 weeks to fix.
The worst one is that we haven't been able to speak to any one of our immediate families at this stage. There are a few privileged ones who managed to get to a satellite phone and be able to check.
Scientists are also worried about a potential environmental crisis because of volcanic ash which could affect crops and sea life.
And that basically had an impact on basically water, drinking water sources, on vegetation, grazing for animals, etc., because the volcanic ash is toxic.
2 New Zealand Navy vessels are now on their way to Tonga with much-needed drinking water and essential supplies, while locals clear the main airport of ash to allow emergency flights from several countries, including China, which has offered food, water and disaster relief equipment. Sir Michael says it's just the beginning of a long-term relief project to help Tonga recover.
So it's the real necessities that need to go first, and then as weeks go, things shift a bit. It might be starting to start to rebuild houses, put lives back together.
And judging by the damage, Tonga is going to need a lot of help to get back on its feet. Owen Poland, CGTN, Auckland.
China's President Xi Jinping has sent a message of condolence to the King of Tonga over the severe damage caused by the volcanic eruption. Xi said China is willing to provide support to help the Tongan people rebuild their homes. China's ambassador to the country has been telling CGTN about the devastation.
Houses on some of the islands were all destroyed by the tsunami. The exact number of casualties is still being counted. The volcanic ash has contaminated water throughout the country, making drinking water difficult to access. Crops have been devastated. Overall, the country experienced heavy property losses. Volcanic ash is still in the air, which can harm people's respiratory systems. so the government is urging people to avoid going out and wear face masks. The public is complying with the emergency measures, and they are working together to overcome the difficulties. Overall, social order remains in place.
Well, the environmental impact of the Tonga volcano is being felt 10,000 kilometers away in Peru. An oil spill there is being blamed on the tsunami wave triggered by the eruption. Dan Collins reports now from Lima.
The eruption of an undersea volcano in Tonga has had an impact as far away as Peru. Authorities say unusually high waves caused an oil spill. They say it was controlled within hours, but the cleanup is ongoing. Peru's Civil Defense Institute said a ship was loading oil onto the Lampampia refinery on the Pacific coast when strong waves moved the boat and caused the spill. The government has not said how many gallons were spilled, only that authorities were working to clean the coast. The Lampampia refinery in Callao province near Lima belongs to Spanish company Repsol. Waves crossing the Pacific after the eruption drowned 2 people in Peru and caused flooding in several coastal towns. Dan Collins, CGTN, Lima.
Saudi Arabia's energy minister has argued for a future role for fossil fuels, saying they should not be sacrificed to tackle climate change. At the virtual World Economic Forum, he said CO2 reduction by carbon capture is still possible without dumping coal and gas completely.
Are we after getting rid of hydrocarbon and fossil fuel, using climate change as a pretext for that to happen? Or are we really sincere and serious in attending to climate change? And if we are, we should be indifferent about what sort of energy resource is used, so long it is being mitigated.
Well, while they're talking energy markets at the virtual Davos gathering, oil prices are reaching 7-year highs, with both major benchmarks rallying over tightening supplies and festering geopolitical tensions. Juliet Mann has been watching the numbers. Juliet.
Thanks, Jamie and Robin. Yes, oil prices are up for the 4th day running, and that's after a fire on a pipeline from Iraq to Turkey briefly stopped flows. That increased concerns about an already tight supply that's given impetus to the latest price rally. Let's take a look at some of the prices. Brent crude futures, now they were up $80 to $88 a barrel, and WTI, the other benchmark in the States, that was trading at $86 a barrel a short time ago. Now, some analysts, though, think prices could hit $100 a barrel. So here's what's going on. Now, supply looks to continue to be tight throughout 2022, in part because demand is holding up despite the spread of the Omicron coronavirus variant. The latest report from the OPEC group of oil-producing nations confirmed what the market's been pricing in for weeks, that demand indeed remains robust. But efforts by producers to restore output is insufficient. Security concerns, too, they are also adding to supply fears. There have been issues in the Middle East, and potential conflict between Russia and Ukraine could disrupt Europe's gas price, cause severe supply chain issues, while any reprisals, such as economic sanctions, would also drive up oil prices. Let's talk to Ellen Ward, who's president of Transversal Consulting and Energy Consultancy. Great to see you again, Ellen. I'm wondering, are you focused on supply and demand factors, or do you anticipate that oil prices will rise because of how investors are feeling about commodities in general right now?
I do think that supply and demand is definitely lifting prices up from the ranges that we've previously seen them in. There's definitely a sense that the pandemic restrictions are receding and that demand is really surging forward, particularly because despite supply chain issues, economic growth is roaring around the world. Now, there are definitely some signs that inflation could cause some of this economic growth to be tempered. Particularly high gas prices in Europe could definitely put a damper on some of that. But we've got a whole host of geopolitical considerations that are also acting on oil prices, as you mentioned. Tensions in the Ukraine are definitely helping to keep prices up now. So it is possible we could see prices spiking to $100 a barrel if we get that kind of magic mix of geopolitics, demand, supply at certain points during the year. Though I do think that the fundamentals reading is really not supporting sustained triple-digit prices.
It's interesting you call it a magic mix. And let's talk about some potentially one-off events, you know, like that fire on the pipeline between Iraq and Turkey that's briefly stopped flows. I mean, what's the potential impact of something like that?
Exactly. Well, when you have a situation where supply and demand is already kind of tight, we're seeing in all sorts of oil stores around the world, we're seeing that stores are below the 5-year average. So when you're in a situation like this, and then you have an event, say a drone attack on the UAE or a fire on an oil pipeline, turned out it was caused by a falling electrical pole, and the issue was corrected. But, you know, initially the thought was obviously terrorism. And so there's the potential for, say, you know, 400,000 barrels a day of oil to come offline for any period of time. That's going to jack up prices. Now it's been resolved, but this kind of incident reminds traders in the market that the potential for these kinds of incidents is there. And, you know, we can't necessarily anticipate what they will be or when they will hit.
What about the impact of going green on oil prices? And did you anticipate maybe a reluctance to invest in oil because of the energy transition?
Yeah, this is a big issue in the United States. We're seeing a lack of desire on the part of oil companies, particularly in the fracking areas, to invest in really growing production at the same rates that we saw previously. And part of that definitely has to do with a concern about regulations, climate regulations, energy transition policies, lack of investment coming, lack of desire from banks to lend money for these kinds of projects, despite the fact that with high oil prices, there would be a strong return on investment.
Ellen Ward, always great talking to you. Thank you very much. We're going to be looking out for those magic ingredients all at once. See, keep an eye on oil prices, Jamie.
Julia, thank you very much.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, averting war in Europe. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken calls on Russia to choose a diplomatic path on Ukraine.
It is now important that all of us in Europe act very swiftly.
Fines for the non-vaccinated will most likely be between $1,000 and $4,000.
The new Omicron variant circulating in southern Africa.
The financial markets have also reacted badly to the news.
Growing dissatisfaction with the way the Dutch government is handling the pandemic.
Cancelling the city's main public Christmas markets for the second year in a row.
Protests and riots by those opposed to restrictions and vaccinations.
There is no room for complacency in this ongoing battle against COVID.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans?
grey rhinos, and unicorn companies. Make sense of it all with global business, only on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top story is disruption across the world as several airlines cancel flights into the United States and a row about aviation safety and new 5G phone providers.
Does Xbox have the X factor? Shares in PlayStation's Sony tumble after its rival plans the biggest deal in gaming history.
The UK Prime Minister fighting for political survival as senior members of his own party call on him to resign.
And the cost of living continues to soar. British inflation hits its highest level in 30 years.
Russia could launch an attack on Ukraine at very short notice. That's the blunt warning from US Secretary of State Antony Blinken as he arrives in Kiev as part of Washington's latest diplomatic efforts to try to avert war. More than 100,000 Russian troops have amassed near the Ukrainian border, but Moscow has repeatedly denied any plan to invade its neighbour. Our correspondent Stephanie Freed is in Ukraine's capital, Kiev. Stephanie, Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, on a new diplomatic mission to try to avert war.
That's right. In his own words, Secretary of State Blinken is on a path of relentless diplomacy to de-escalate the current crisis. In meetings on Wednesday with Ukraine's President Zelensky, with other Ukrainian officials, he talked about that pursuit of de-escalation, talks, negotiation with Russia, and a peaceful path to resolution of the current crisis. However, Secretary of State Blinken is also pragmatic, and he talked about the reality of the troop buildup, of what is now reported as Russian troop movements into Belarus, the concern of an offensive coming from Belarus, which opens another front essentially surrounding Ukraine. He talked about the short notice, if there is a Russian offensive, the short notice that Ukraine would have of such an offensive. And he talked about the fact that now is a critical time for Ukraine and that essentially there are two ways out of the current crisis. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
We have tried to make clear that there are two paths for Russia. There is the path of diplomacy and dialogue to try to resolve whatever differences there are peacefully through diplomacy. Clearly the preferable path, clearly the most responsible path, and the one that we would prefer. But there is also the path, if Russia chooses to renew aggression, of confrontation and consequences for Russia. And we have been working to build out both of those paths in very close coordination and collaboration with allies and partners.
And Stephanie, frantic diplomatic efforts go on elsewhere.
That's right. From Kiev, Secretary of State Blinken will be traveling to Berlin on Thursday. He'll be meeting with Germany's foreign minister and what is called the transatlantic quad, made up of the United States, England, France, and Germany, members of that, or representatives of those countries, talking about a response, possible response to the current crisis from all sides, response to possible aggression, continued diplomacy, continued de-escalation, and from there, on Friday, he heads to Geneva, and that's where he'll be holding a critical meeting with Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. According to what the State Department is reporting, Russia is seeking point-by-point answers from the United States, from Secretary of State Blinken, to demands that Russia made several weeks ago, security demands that Russia says they want in writing from the United States. No indication from the State Department whether they will give a point-by-point response, but the meeting between Russia's foreign minister and the U.S. Secretary of State certainly does indicate that diplomacy on some level is still alive. Jamie.
Stephanie, thanks for that. Stephanie Fried, our correspondent in Kiev.
Europe must be more united on security in the face of destabilisation efforts. The words of France's President Macron speaking at the European Parliament. He said the EU urgently needed a unified political plan to find stability with Russia, one of a number of priorities for France's 6-month EU presidency. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Ryan Thompson in Paris. So, Ryan, a lot of big plans from Macron with a common theme of unity and strength. What else did he have to say?
Yeah, absolutely. That's right, Robin. This was the third big meeting of Emmanuel Macron's tenure as he takes on the 6-month presidency of the European Council. Of course, he kicked off the year meeting with Ursula von der Leyen here in Paris, and then just days later with Charles Michel of the European Council. But for this specific occasion, he has taken himself out of the French capital, heading to Strasbourg to meet with MEPs to try and explain his agenda on their territory. It was a very symbolic speech where he really took a look at Europe's history and tried to apply that to today's current political context and really underscore for these MEPs why that matters so much and what they need to be thinking about in terms of the European project and the European Union. Obviously, much of this has to do with tensions with Russia, which have increased in recent months and weeks, notably on that border with Ukraine. You just heard there from Stephanie. Emmanuel Macron called for a unity on a new security project. Currently, we already have the Normandy format talks, but that only involves France, Germany, Ukraine, and Russia. He wants to see a type of discussion, a type of dialogue between the two sides that will really include the European-wide voice. He said it is critical to do this in order to protect Europe's sovereignty. Take a listen.
Over these next few weeks, we must put together a European proposal to build a new order of security and stability. We must build it among Europeans, then share it with our allies within the framework of NATO, and then we must present it to Russia for negotiation.
Now, of course, this speech also looked at other priorities of France's 6-month tenure at the European Council presidency. Notably, that includes digitalizations, an EU-wide minimum wage, taking on big tech. You know, Emmanuel Macron had stressed going into this that he wanted to use this EU Council presidency to bring Europe into the 21st century, to really bring on some modernizations. But there are two hot files sitting on his desk that have almost distracted him a little bit to getting down to work on those priorities. One of them, of course, being this escalating security situation between Ukraine and Russia, and the other one being the COVID-19 pandemic, Robin.
And Ryan, Macron has a presidential election coming up in April, so how much of this is geared towards his domestic audience in France?
Well, you know, Robin, not so much of it. We hear sort of two voices from Emmanuel Macron. One is on the European stage and one is on the domestic stage. Domestically, he is leading in the polls. He continues to do so, seeing about a 26 to 27% of the vote in that first round of election come April. But it does seem to be that, at least on that context, he's pushing more to the right, and that really aligns with his political appointees, his policy priorities, everything he's done over the past year as he's aligned himself to run in this election. Though, again, important to underscore here, he has not yet announced his candidacy in the run-up to this. On the European stage, it's much more to the left, talking about this European vision, working together, what it means to be part of the 27 member states. Some of his opponents, though, not big fans of that, and includes Marine Le Pen, who is currently polling second. I'm sure you remember her from 2017. She has really attacked him, coming out swinging, saying that this should not be what Emmanuel Macron is focusing on right now.
Ryan, thanks very much. Ryan Thompson there in Paris.
Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi is to meet Russia's Vladimir Putin. Tehran is seeking stronger ties with Moscow as it looks to withstand political and economic pressure from the United States. The meeting will be Raisi's most important visit abroad since he took office in August, and the first visit by an Iranian president to Russia since 2017.
A court in Belgium has sentenced a man to 15 years in jail, with 17 others also receiving sentences after being found guilty of being part of a gang smuggling Vietnamese migrants into the UK. The men were arrested after the deaths of 39 people found in the back of a truck in Essex in 2019. Several people have already been jailed, while dozens more face charges in France.
A Syrian doctor has gone on trial in Germany for crimes against humanity. He's accused of torturing and murdering prisoners in Syria in 2011 and 2012, charges that he denies. He arrived in Germany in 2015 and practiced medicine until his arrest. It's one of a number of trials being held in Europe under the principle of universal jurisdiction, which allows serious crimes to be prosecuted even if they were committed in another country.
COVID restrictions will be eased in England from next Thursday. The lifting of the so-called Plan B will mean face coverings will no longer be mandatory in public places, while a requirement for COVID passports to enter nightclubs and large events will also end. People will also no longer be encouraged to work from home. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson said scientists believed cases of the Omicron variant had now peaked.
Japan has widened its COVID restrictions to include the capital, Tokyo, and a dozen regions as the Omicron variant there fuels a record number of infections. The move allows each region to decide what measures to introduce, with calls for bars and restaurants to shorten opening hours or halt alcohol sales.
The head of the World Health Organization has told world leaders that the COVID-19 pandemic is nowhere near over. Dr. Tedros also warned against the assumption that the dominant Omicron variant is significantly milder, saying it's causing both hospitalizations and deaths. That comes as record infection numbers were recorded across Europe.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, we'll take you to Spain next as the world's tourism bosses gather to ponder new departures and the industry's future after the pandemic.
So this is it. I'm just about to be shot.
Tents here, bottles are being thrown as they do so.
There are about 3 critical bridges here in Malawi. That's one of them. We're going to cross that bridge.
As you can see behind me, police forces
who are replying with gas. Gas just came in.
Gas. So it's all begun now. Divisions leading the charge into West Mosul have brought us here.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots.
This is where most of the fighting has been concentrated.
It's the front line now after 9 days of fighting.
We're about 2 to 3 kilometers from
within
the front
clear
line.
view of this front line position.
Murray, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. Tourism bosses are heading to Spain as one of the world's biggest events for international travel gets underway in Madrid.
The fair's focus this year is how the industry can survive during the pandemic. Rahul Pathak reports from Madrid.
Spain, like much of Europe, is in the midst of a coronavirus crisis due to the new Omicron variant. But the atmosphere here at FITUR is business as usual. Nearly 90,000 visitors, including industry professionals and members of the public, are expected to visit over the next 4 days. These numbers have doubled since last year. Tourism is hugely significant globally. It's estimated that 1 in 10 people around the world is employed in this sector. The delegates and industry professionals here are already planning for a post-pandemic surge in trade.
They are both looking for the summer 2022 and also for the season of 2023. Everybody is getting used to the pandemic and everybody is, trying to look ahead and improve their business.
Now, the tourism sector was one of those industries hardest hit by the financial fallout of coronavirus. Now, 2021 did see a slight recovery, but that recovery was hampered somewhat with the outbreak of new variants like Omicron. In 2022, industry experts say should see that recovery gather pace, and for the tourist-reliant Spanish economy, it's absolutely vital that it does so. Tourism accounted for 10.5% of Spain's GDP in 2021, much of it generated by domestic travel. Experts believe travel in and around Europe will also increase in 2022. However, the industry is still struggling with intercontinental travel, but countries like China are making a concerted effort at this expo, planning for the summer and beyond in a bid to encourage more people to once again consider Asia as a destination.
The tourist industry as a whole in China is pretty optimistic that we will recover after COVID. According to information that we have from the Chinese Aviation Authority, our country will open again fully by next year for international flights. I think that is a really good sign for our tourism industry.
Industry experts have earmarked 2023 as a complete rerun to pre-pandemic levels for international tourism. If this expo is any indicator, there certainly seems to be the desire and belief that it will happen. Rahul Pathak, CGTN, Madrid.
The Netherlands' cultural institutions have defied COVID rules, opening briefly to protest against still being in lockdown.
While many rules were eased last weekend, allowing gyms and shops to reopen, cultural venues were ordered to remain closed to the public until at least the 25th of January.
Our correspondent Stefan de Vries reports now from Amsterdam.
An unusual sight in the Netherlands today. People taking yoga classes or getting their hair cut in museums and theatres all around the country. Shops, sports clubs and hairdressers have now reopened after the Dutch government eased the semi-lockdown imposed a month ago. But entertainment venues, just like this theatre, must stay closed. A TV host and actor came up with the idea of protesting this decision by transforming theatres into barbershops for a day. Quickly, dozens of cultural venues around the country joined the movement. Since gyms are allowed to open, some museums will join the protest by offering sports classes on Wednesday, just like Amsterdam's History Museum. Others will put artworks on sale so as to qualify as shops. In all the venues, participants had to book a time slot online.
Within 5 minutes, all the tickets were sold out.
Although the protests do not comply with the current coronavirus restrictions, the cultural institutions are respecting all the usual precautions, sufficient social distance and a check on vaccination status.
Museums and other cultural institutions like theaters are completely safe. We can do the 1.5 meter distance, we can, all the rules apply for us, and big stores already have been opened up yet, and the cultural field not. So this is sort of soft power resistance.
Mayors in many cities have said that they will not tolerate today's cultural protest. Some cultural venues received official warnings, though there were no reports of any incidents. Next week, the Dutch government will assess the situation and may decide to reopen the theatres, cinemas and museums again. But until then, culture lovers will have to settle for a yoga mat or a new haircut. Stefan de Vries, CGTN, Amsterdam.
The headlines again. Travel disruption across the world as several airlines cancel flights into the United States in a row about aviation safety and new 5G phone providers.
Our other headlines: does Xbox have the X Factor? Shares in PlayStation Sony tumble after its rival plans the biggest deal in gaming history.
The threat of war in Europe. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken calls on Russia to choose a diplomatic path on Ukraine.
The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is fighting for his political survival as senior members of his own party call on him to resign.
And the cost of living continues to soar. British inflation hits its highest level in 30 years.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Preview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.